Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in and let's begin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Arizona desert when Marcel Beaumont found her collapsed beside the dried creek bed, her massive frame crumpled against a boulder like a fallen monument to some forgotten god. At first glance, he thought he was looking at a man. Few women reached 6.5 feet in height, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown steer. But as he dismounted from his horse and approached carefully, rifle ready, he saw the unmistakable curves beneath the torn buckskin dress and the long black hair matted with blood and desert dust. She was Apache. That much was clear from her clothing and the intricate beadwork that decorated what remained of her garments. Her face, even unconscious and battered, held the kind of fierce beauty that belonged to people who had never known submission, whose ancestors had carved lives from stone and sand through will alone. Fresh wounds crisscrossed her arms and legs, while older scars spoke of battles fought and survived against odds that would have broken smaller spirits. Marcel had lived alone on his remote ranch for 5 years, and in all that time, he'd never encountered anything quite like this woman who seemed to exist on a scale larger than ordinary life. His first instinct was to ride away quickly, to leave the unconscious Apache woman for the buzzards and pretend he'd never seen her. Relations between whites and Apaches in this territory were tense at best, deadly at worst, and taking in a wounded Indian could bring down the wrath of both the U.S. Army and whatever tribal warriors might come looking for her. But as he turned toward his horse, she stirred slightly, a soft moan escaping her lips that sounded more human than dangerous, more vulnerable than threatening. Marcel had spent the war years as a field medic, and those skills had saved more lives than his rifle had taken in the years since. He could see from her injuries that she'd been fleeing something terrible. The wounds were too systematic to be accidental, too fresh to have healed properly without treatment. Dehydration and blood loss were killing her slowly, and despite every rational argument his survival instincts could muster, he found himself kneeling beside her with his water bottle, lifting her head gently while liquid salvation trickled between her parched lips. When her eyes opened and met his, Marcel felt something shift inside his chest, like tectonic plates finding new positions after an earthquake. Her gaze held depths of pain and wisdom that spoke of experiences no human should endure, but also a flicker of something that might have been hope, or might have been the calculating assessment of a predator deciding whether the man before her represented salvation or simply a different kind of threat. "Easy," he said softly, his voice rusty from weeks of talking only to his horse and his cattle. "You're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, he wondered if either of them would survive the consequences of this moment of compassion. 3 days earlier, Ayana had been preparing for her wedding ceremony in the hidden canyon where her band of Chiricahua Apache had made their winter camp. Her unusual height, making her both a prize and a burden among people who valued strength but also feared anything that deviated too far from the natural order. At 23, she had reached the age where marriage was no longer optional but necessary for survival, and Goyathle, the war chief's son, had claimed her as his bride with the kind of possessive pride that treated women as trophies to be displayed rather than partners to be cherished. The ceremony had been interrupted by the arrival of cavalry scouts who had finally tracked their hidden refuge, their blue uniforms stark against the red stone walls as they surrounded the canyon with the methodical precision of men who had perfected the art of Apache hunting. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre, as the peaceful winter camp became a killing ground where old men and children fell alongside warriors who had no time to organize defense against an enemy that had chosen surprise over honor. Ayana's size had saved her life when smaller family members had been cut down around her, her long legs carrying her up cliff faces that would have been impassable to ordinary people. Her strength allowing her to fight through soldiers who expected Indian women to cower and submit rather than resist with the fury of cornered mountain lions. She had seen her intended husband fall with 3 bullets in his chest, had watched her younger sister disappear beneath a cavalry saber, had witnessed the destruction of everything she'd ever known in the space of minutes that felt like hours. The flight that followed had tested every survival skill her Apache upbringing had provided, as she moved through terrain that would have killed softer people while carrying wounds that would have stopped lesser spirits. For 3 days, she had evaded pursuit that seemed to anticipate her every move, soldiers who knew Apache tactics well enough to predict where a fleeing woman might seek water, shelter, or the kind of concealment that could mean the difference between life and death in country that showed no mercy to the weak or unlucky. By the time she collapsed beside the dry creek bed, Ayana had reached the limits of even her exceptional endurance, her body finally surrendering to blood loss and dehydration, while her spirit raged against the unfairness of surviving the massacre only to die alone in empty desert, where her bones would bleach white under the merciless sun. The last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was the sound of approaching hoofbeats, and the bitter irony that death would probably arrive wearing cavalry blue, completing the destruction that had begun in the hidden canyon where her people had made their final stand. Marcel's ranch house had been built for solitude rather than hospitality, its single bedroom and sparse furnishings reflecting 5 years of a man who had fled human company after experiencing too much of humanity's capacity for destruction during the war. But as he carried the unconscious Apache woman across his threshold, her weight impressive even for someone of his own considerable size, he realized that his hermit existence was about to be complicated in ways he'd never imagined possible. The bedroom that had been his private refuge became a makeshift infirmary as he cleaned and dressed wounds that told stories of violence and survival that made his own war experiences seem almost civilized by comparison. Her injuries were serious but not fatal, assuming infection didn't set in, and as he worked with the methodical care his military medical training had instilled, he found himself studying her face with the kind of fascination usually reserved for natural wonders that defied easy categorization. Even unconscious and wounded, she radiated a presence that filled his small house like a force of nature barely contained by human form. Her hands, when he cleaned the cuts on her palms, were calloused from work and warfare, but retained a feminine grace that spoke to complexity beyond simple strength. Her face, relaxed in sleep, revealed beauty that was both fierce and vulnerable, the kind that belonged to people who had learned to survive through courage rather than protection from others. The practical challenges of her presence began asserting themselves as evening approached, and Marcel realized he'd committed himself to sheltering someone whose very existence in his home could bring deadly consequences from multiple directions. The cavalry patrols that occasionally passed through his remote valley would shoot first and investigate later if they discovered him harboring an Apache fugitive, while any tribal warriors searching for her might assume he'd taken her captive rather than rescued her from death in the desert. But it was during the long night watch, as he sat beside her bed monitoring her breathing and checking for signs of fever, that Marcel began to understand he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Her presence had already changed something fundamental about his carefully constructed isolation, filling spaces in his life that he'd convinced himself were better left empty. As she stirred restlessly in sleep, murmuring words in Apache that he couldn't understand but that sounded like prayers or perhaps farewells, he realized that saving her life might have been the easy part. Learning to live with the consequences of that choice would test both of them in ways that neither was prepared to face. When Ayana fully awakened on the second day, her first act was to search for weapons that weren't there. Her second was to assess escape routes from a room that suddenly felt like a trap. And her third was to study the white man who sat quietly in the corner chair, offering water but maintaining the kind of respectful distance that suggested he understood how dangerous cornered predators could be. Her dark eyes took in everything: the quality of his clothes, the positioning of his hands, the exits and obstacles between her and freedom, with the systematic evaluation of someone who had survived by reading situations correctly and acting decisively. "You speak English?" Marcel asked gently, noting the intelligence in her gaze and the way she'd automatically cataloged his small arsenal of hunting rifles and working knives. When she nodded once, a barely perceptible acknowledgement that she understood his question, he continued with the kind of careful courtesy he might use with a wild animal that had wandered into his home. "I'm Marcel Beaumont. This is my ranch. You were dying by the creek, so I brought you here to heal." Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the crisp pronunciation of someone who had learned English from educated speakers rather than picking it up through casual contact with frontier traders and soldiers. "Why?" The single word contained volumes of suspicion. Experience with white men whose kindness typically came with prices that Indian women were expected to pay in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude. Her question hung in the air between them like a challenge, demanding honesty from someone she had every reason not to trust. Marcel's answer surprised them both with its simplicity and apparent sincerity. "Because you needed help, and I was the only one there to provide it." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully before continuing. "I know what it's like to lose everything in a single day. To have the world you understood disappear while you're left to figure out how to keep breathing in what remains. Nobody should have to face that alone." His words carried the weight of personal experience with grief and survival, suggesting depths of understanding that went beyond simple humanitarian impulse. The conversation that followed was halting and careful, with both participants testing boundaries and assessing trustworthiness through questions that revealed as much about the asker as the answerer. Ayanna learned that Marcel had been living alone since the war ended, that his nearest neighbors were a day's ride away, and that his knowledge of Apache customs came from years of respectful interaction with tribal traders who had found him trustworthy enough to do business with. Marcel discovered that her English had been learned from a missionary teacher who had briefly lived among her people, that her unusual size had made her both valued and isolated within her own community, and that the massacre that had driven her into the desert had destroyed the last remnants of her band's traditional way of life. The days that followed established a routine that neither of them had planned, but both found surprisingly comfortable. Despite the cultural chasm that separated their backgrounds and the practical dangers that her presence in his home represented, Ayanna proved to be a patient who followed medical instructions with the discipline of someone accustomed to enduring pain without complaint, while Marcel discovered that having another person in his house after years of solitude was less disruptive than he'd expected and more welcome than he'd dared admit. Her recovery progressed steadily as proper food and rest allowed her body to heal from trauma that would have killed smaller, less determined people. But it was her mind that proved most fascinating to Marcel, as their careful conversations revealed an intelligence that had been shaped by Apache practical wisdom and missionary education into something unique and impressive. She understood complex concepts about everything from astronomy to animal behavior, while her insights into survival techniques and natural medicine far exceeded his own considerable frontier knowledge. The language barrier that he'd expected proved minimal, as Ayanna's English was actually superior to that of most frontier settlers, flavored with an accent that made everyday words sound like poetry while retaining the precise articulation of someone who had learned the language through formal instruction. She spoke of her people's history and customs with the reverence of someone preserving sacred knowledge, but also with the pragmatic acceptance of someone who understood that adaptation was often the only alternative to extinction. Marcel found himself sharing stories about his own past that he'd never spoken aloud, the war experiences that had driven him west, the family he'd lost to fever and cholera, the gradual realization that solitude might be preferable to the kind of human companionship that seemed to inevitably lead to loss and disappointment. Ayanna listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that survival often depended on learning from others' experiences, her occasional questions revealing understanding that went deeper than simple curiosity. It was during the evening of her first week of recovery, as they sat on his front porch watching stars emerge over the desert landscape that had nearly claimed her life, that Marcel realized his feelings toward his unexpected guest were evolving beyond simple compassion into something more complex and potentially dangerous. Her presence had transformed his hermit's refuge into something that felt almost like a home, while her strength and intelligence had awakened appetites for companionship that he'd convinced himself were better left dormant. As she spoke about the Apache belief that some encounters were predetermined by forces larger than human understanding, he wondered if finding her by that dry creek bed had been accident or destiny, and whether he was prepared to accept the implications of either possibility. The morning Ayanna first joined Marcel in his daily ranch work marked a turning point in their careful coexistence, as her insistence on contributing to her own maintenance revealed capabilities that transformed what had been a rescue situation into something approaching partnership. Her knowledge of horses proved exceptional, with an instinctive understanding of animal behavior that allowed her to gentle, skittish mounts that had given Marcel trouble for months. Watching her work, he began to understand that her unusual size was paired with equally unusual grace and strength that made her uniquely suited for tasks that challenged ordinary people. Her help with the daily routine of feeding cattle and maintaining equipment revealed just how isolated Marcel had become during his years of self-imposed exile, as having another person to share the work made him realize how much of his energy had been consumed by tasks that two people could accomplish with far less effort. But it was the easy companionship that developed during their shared labor that proved most significant. As conversations flowed naturally while they worked, creating the kind of comfortable intimacy that comes when people discover their personalities complement each other in unexpected ways. The first real test of their developing relationship came when a cavalry patrol appeared on the horizon, their blue uniforms clearly visible as they approached the ranch buildings with the purposeful movement that suggested official business rather than casual visit. Marcel's immediate reaction was to hide Ayanna, but her calm refusal to flee surprised him with its quiet dignity. "If they find me hiding, we're both dead," she said with the practical wisdom of someone who understood that survival sometimes required courage rather than caution. "If they see me working beside you, they might think I'm just another ranch hand." The deception that followed tested both of their abilities to appear casual, while their hearts hammered with the knowledge that discovery could mean death for both of them. The patrol leader, a grizzled sergeant whose weathered face spoke of years spent hunting Apaches across the territorial vastness, accepted Marcel's explanation that his hired hand was a mixed-blood Mexican whose size made him valuable for heavy work. Ayanna's carefully lowered eyes and deferential posture supported the fiction, while her fluent Spanish, learned from Mexican traders who had dealings with her people, provided convincing responses to the few questions directed her way. As the patrol rode away, satisfied that they'd found nothing suspicious, Marcel felt something shift in his relationship with the woman who had just risked everything to protect his safety, as well as her own. The courage she'd shown in facing potential discovery, combined with the intelligence she'd displayed in maintaining their deception, revealed character that went far beyond simple survival instinct into the realm of loyalty and mutual protection. When she turned to him with a smile that held both relief and something deeper, he realized that their partnership had evolved beyond host and guest into something that felt dangerously close to what people might call love. The weeks that followed the cavalry patrol's visit brought a new awareness to their daily interactions. as if the shared deception had created intimacy that neither of them had been prepared to acknowledge. Marcel found himself noticing details about Ayanna that had nothing to do with her exceptional size or her remarkable survival skills. The way lamplight caught gold highlights in her black hair, the graceful efficiency of her movements as she worked around the ranch, the musical quality of her laughter when something genuinely amused her rather than simply meeting social expectations. Their evening conversations had evolved from careful exchanges of basic information into discussions that revealed the depths of two intelligent people, discovering they had more in common than their vastly different backgrounds might suggest. Ayanna's insights into the natural world came from a lifetime of observation and Apache teaching that viewed all living things as interconnected parts of a larger whole, while Marcel's formal education provided scientific explanations for phenomena that her people understood through spiritual and practical frameworks. Together, they created understanding that neither could have achieved alone. The physical awareness between them was becoming harder to ignore, despite their careful maintenance of appropriate boundaries and their mutual understanding that acknowledging attraction could complicate everything about their arrangement. When their hands touched during shared work, the contact lingered longer than necessity required. When they sat together on the porch in the evening, the space between them seemed charged with possibilities that neither felt ready to explore, but both found increasingly difficult to dismiss. It was Ayanna who first spoke of the growing tension between them, her directness characteristic of someone raised in a culture that valued honest communication over polite evasion. "I see how you look at me," she said during one of their evening talks, her voice carrying neither accusation nor invitation, but simply acknowledgement of reality that was becoming too obvious to ignore. "And I feel the same pull toward you. But we must be careful about what we allow to develop between us." Her words forced Marcel to confront feelings he'd been trying to rationalize as simple loneliness or gratitude for companionship after years of isolation. The attraction he felt toward her went beyond physical desire into emotional territory that seemed both natural and impossible. Given the cultural barriers and practical dangers that surrounded any relationship between a white rancher and an Apache woman in territorial Arizona. When he admitted that he'd been struggling with the same awareness, her understanding smile suggested that acknowledging their mutual attraction might be the first step toward figuring out how to manage feelings that were growing stronger, despite every rational argument against allowing them to flourish. The drought that had been building throughout the summer reached crisis levels in late August, when the well that had supplied Marcel's ranch for 5 years finally went dry, leaving them with barely enough water for immediate survival and no reserves for the cattle that represented his entire livelihood. The nearest reliable water source was a spring in the foothills, 15 miles away through country where Apache raiding parties and cavalry patrols made travel dangerous for anyone, but especially perilous for a white man traveling with an Indian woman of unusual appearance. Ayanna's knowledge of the terrain and water sources proved invaluable as they planned a route that would minimize their exposure to both military patrols and potential hostile encounters with her own people, who might not distinguish between a captive and a voluntary companion when they saw her traveling with a white man. Her understanding of seasonal water patterns and hidden springs offered alternatives that Marcel's maps didn't show, while her tracking skills could help them avoid dangerous encounters that his frontier experience might miss. The journey itself became a test of their developing partnership as they navigated not just physical dangers but the emotional complexity of traveling together as something more than host and guest, but less than the lovers they were becoming. The enforced intimacy of camping under the open sky, sharing meals and watches, and the kind of casual physical contact that came from sleeping near each other for warmth and security intensified the attraction that both had been trying to manage through careful distance and appropriate behavior. It was during the second night of their water-seeking expedition, as they sat by a carefully concealed fire in a sheltered canyon, that Ayanna spoke about her feelings with the kind of honesty that left no room for misunderstanding or polite deflection. "I know what people would say about us," she said, her dark eyes reflecting firelight as she spoke. "Apache and white. Enemy peoples whose children are raised to fear and hate each other. But I also know what I feel when I look at you, and what I see in your eyes when you look at me." Marcel's response came from a heart that had been softened by weeks of companionship with someone who challenged every assumption he'd made about what was possible between people from different worlds. "I've spent 5 years convincing myself that I was better off alone," he said, reaching across the fire to take her hand with a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. "But being with you has shown me the difference between existing and living. Whatever the world thinks about us doesn't matter as much as what we think about each other." Their first kiss, shared under a canopy of desert stars with danger lurking in every shadow, sealed a commitment that both knew would change everything about their carefully constructed lives. The spring they found nestled in a hidden canyon proved more generous than either had dared hope, its clear water flowing from underground sources that would remain reliable even during the worst drought conditions. But more significant than solving their immediate water crisis was the way working together to establish a water-hauling routine had solidified their emotional connection into something that felt permanent rather than temporary, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared goals that extended far beyond simple attraction or convenience. The days spent establishing a camp near the spring and organizing the logistics of transporting water back to the ranch created opportunities for intimacy that their careful propriety at the homestead had prevented. Away from the social expectations and potential dangers that their unusual relationship represented, they could explore feelings that had been building for weeks, without fear of discovery or judgment from a world that would never understand what had developed between them. Ayana's revelations about her past relationships within Apache society helped Marcel understand that her feelings for him represented more than just gratitude or temporary attraction born of isolation and trauma. She had been considered unmarriageable by many in her band because of her unusual size and independence, while the men who had shown interest were typically motivated by desire to control her strength rather than appreciate her intelligence and character. "You're the first man who has looked at me and seen a partner rather than a problem to be managed," she told him as they worked together to construct a more permanent water storage system. Marcel's own admissions about his retreat from human companionship after the war revealed motivations that went deeper than simple war trauma into territory involving fundamental questions about whether people were capable of the kind of love that justified the inevitable pain of loss. "I convinced myself that caring about someone was just setting yourself up for heartbreak," he said, while they shared an evening meal beside the spring that had become their temporary sanctuary. "But being with you has taught me that the heartbreak comes from not caring, from cutting yourself off from the possibility of connection." Their physical relationship developed with the same careful progression that had marked their emotional intimacy, each step forward feeling both inevitable and chosen, natural expressions of feelings that had grown too strong to contain within the boundaries of friendship or simple partnership. When they made love for the first time under the star-filled desert sky, it felt like a completion of something that had been building since the moment he'd found her dying beside the dry creek bed, two lost souls discovering that together they could create something neither had believed possible alone. The journey back to the ranch brought them face to face with the practical realities of maintaining their relationship in a world that would view their love as everything from scandalous to illegal, depending on whose laws and customs were applied to their situation. The easy intimacy they'd shared at the hidden spring would have to be carefully managed once they returned to a homestead that was visible to passing travelers and subject to unexpected visits from military patrols or neighboring ranchers. The water crisis that had driven them into the foothills proved to be a blessing in disguise, as establishing a reliable supply from the spring required regular trips that provided legitimate excuses for spending time away from the ranch together. Their water-hauling expeditions became opportunities for the kind of private companionship that their situation otherwise made impossible, while the practical benefits of their partnership became increasingly obvious to anyone who observed their efficient cooperation. But it was the subtle changes in their daily routine at the ranch that created the greatest challenge to maintaining secrecy about their relationship. Habits developed during their intimate days at the spring carried over into their homestead behavior in ways that spoke louder than words about the nature of their connection. The easy physical contact, the shared glances loaded with private meaning, the comfortable silences that spoke of deep understanding, all created patterns that would be obvious to anyone who knew how to read the signs of people in love. The first real test of their ability to maintain appropriate appearances came when Mac Thornfield, Marcel's nearest neighbor, arrived unexpectedly with news about increased Apache raiding activity in the region and warnings about cavalry plans for massive search-and-destroy operations that would make travel dangerous for anyone caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. His obvious appreciation for Marcel's hired hand was accompanied by questions about where she'd come from and suggestions about other ranchers who might be interested in employing someone with her obvious capabilities. As Marcel deflected inquiries while Ayanna maintained her carefully constructed persona as a mixed-blood Mexican ranch worker, both understood that their relationship existed in a precarious space between private happiness and public danger. Any slip in their performance, any sign that their connection went beyond employer and employee could bring consequences that would destroy not just their love, but possibly their lives. The evening after Thornfield's departure found them sitting on the porch in careful isolation, each lost in thoughts about the price of love that dared to cross boundaries that society had declared absolute and unchangeable. October brought news that made their personal concerns seem trivial compared to the larger conflicts engulfing the territory, as reports filtered in about Geronimo's latest breakout from the reservation and the massive military response that was mobilizing to capture or kill every Apache who had chosen resistance over submission. The countryside was becoming a battleground where anyone with Indian features might be shot on sight, while the Apache warriors who remained free were growing increasingly desperate and dangerous as their options for survival dwindled with each passing day. Ayanna's reaction to the news revealed depths of pain and conflict that went far beyond personal safety into the realm of cultural survival and ethnic loyalty that Marcel was only beginning to understand. Her people were being systematically destroyed, their traditional ways of life eliminated through a combination of military force and government policy that viewed Apache culture as incompatible with American civilization. Every day of freedom she enjoyed on his ranch was purchased with the knowledge that her own people were dying in their struggle to maintain independence that was becoming increasingly impossible to sustain. The arrival of federal marshals in the region, tasked with identifying and removing any Indians who might be living illegally off the reservation, added a new level of urgency to their situation. Unlike military patrols that were primarily concerned with hostile warriors, the marshals were specifically hunting for women, children, and peaceful Indians who might be hiding among white communities, viewing any Apache away from the reservation as potential supporters of the resistance movement. Marcel's growing understanding of the broader political context surrounding their relationship forced him to confront moral questions that went beyond personal happiness into territory involving justice, loyalty, and the kind of choices that defined character under pressure. Protecting Ayanna meant more than just hiding her presence. It meant actively opposing government policies that he'd never questioned before meeting her, challenging assumptions about civilization and savagery that had been part of his worldview since childhood. It was during a conversation about escape plans and emergency procedures that Ayanna revealed the full extent of her internal conflict about their relationship and her presence on his ranch. "Every day I stay here, I'm betraying my people," she said with the kind of quiet anguish that spoke of sleepless nights spent wrestling with impossible choices. "But every day I leave would be betraying my heart and yours. How do I choose between love and duty when both are demanding everything I have to give?" Her question hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything they'd built together, forcing both to acknowledge that their private happiness existed within larger contexts that might ultimately make their love impossible to sustain. The betrayal came from an unexpected source when Cookie Williams, a drifting ranch hand whom Marcel had hired for the autumn roundup, recognized something familiar in Ayanna's features and mannerisms that triggered memories of an Apache woman he'd encountered during his time as an Army scout. His growing suspicions, combined with knowledge of the substantial bounties being offered for information about Indians living illegally off reservations, created temptation that proved stronger than loyalty to an employer who had treated him fairly, but not generously. Cookie's departure from the ranch was so sudden and poorly explained that both Marcel and Ayanna immediately suspected treachery, but their worst fears were confirmed when a full cavalry patrol arrived 3 days later with information that was too specific to have come from casual observation. The commanding officer, Captain Morrison, carried descriptions of Ayanna that included details about her unusual height and distinctive scars that could only have been provided by someone who had observed her closely over an extended period. The confrontation that followed tested every aspect of their carefully constructed deception, as Captain Morrison's questions revealed he already knew more about their situation than their cover story could explain. His examination of Ayanna was thorough and professional, conducted by someone who had spent years learning to distinguish between various Apache bands and identify individuals who might have connections to hostile activities. When he demanded to examine her hands for the distinctive calluses that Apache women developed from traditional craftwork, both knew their deception was crumbling beyond repair. It was Marcel's decision to step forward and claim Ayanna as his wife that created the legal complexity Captain Morrison hadn't anticipated, as territorial marriage laws provided protections that might supersede military authority over Indian affairs. "She's Mrs. Beaumont now," Marcel said with the kind of quiet authority that came from making decisions that couldn't be unmade. "And she's converted to Christianity and renounced her tribal connections. Unless you have evidence of criminal activity, I believe civilian authority takes precedence over military jurisdiction in matters of marriage and religious conversion." The legal argument that followed revealed Captain Morrison to be more sophisticated in his understanding of territorial law than his rough appearance suggested, while also exposing him as someone who viewed technicalities as obstacles to be overcome rather than absolute barriers to achieving his objectives. "Mr. Beaumont," he said with the cold politeness of someone delivering an ultimatum disguised as reasonable conversation, "I'm sure you understand that harboring fugitive Indians is a federal crime regardless of any personal relationships you might have developed. I'll be returning in 1 week with a territorial judge who can sort out the legal complexities of your situation. I strongly suggest you use that time to reconsider your position and the consequences it might have for everyone involved." The week's reprieve granted by Captain Morrison felt both like a gift and a death sentence, as Marcel and Ayanna struggled to find solutions to a legal and practical situation that seemed to offer only choices between bad and worse outcomes. Running away would make them both fugitives from federal law, while staying meant facing a territorial judge whose sympathy for their situation was far from guaranteed and whose decision could result in Ayanna's forcible removal to a reservation where Apache women were dying from disease, despair, and systematic cultural destruction. Their discussions during those desperate days revealed the full complexity of their situation and the depth of feeling that had developed between two people whose love existed in defiance of every social, legal, and cultural boundary, their world recognized. Ayana's willingness to flee everything she'd ever known rather than face separation from Marcel spoke to commitment that went beyond simple romance into the realm of absolute partnership, while his readiness to abandon his ranch and his carefully constructed life demonstrated love that had transformed his understanding of what mattered most. The practical planning for potential flight required them to consider scenarios that ranged from temporary concealment in remote wilderness areas to permanent relocation to Mexican territory, where their relationship might face different challenges but not necessarily the same legal impossibilities. Ayana's knowledge of Apache hiding places and survival techniques, combined with Marcel's financial resources and understanding of territorial transportation networks, created options that were dangerous but not hopeless for people desperate enough to risk everything for love. But it was during their most intimate conversations about the future that both began to understand the full cost of choices that would define the rest of their lives, regardless of which path they selected. "If we run, we'll spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders," Marcel said, as they sat together in what might be their last peaceful evening at the ranch that had become their sanctuary. "But if we stay and fight this through legal channels, we're gambling with your freedom and possibly your life on the chance that justice might actually exist for people like us." Ayana's response revealed the kind of courage that had allowed her people to survive centuries of warfare and persecution while maintaining cultural identity that governments and military forces had been unable to destroy completely. "I've been running since the massacre that brought me to you," she said, her dark eyes reflecting starlight as she spoke about choices that would determine whether their love story ended in triumph or tragedy. "Maybe it's time to stand and fight for something worth keeping even if the odds are against us. You've taught me that some things are valuable enough to risk everything, and this love we've found is definitely one of them." Her words carried the weight of someone who had decided that facing danger together was preferable to finding safety apart, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test not just their relationship, but their faith in the possibility of justice in a world that seemed designed to keep people like them apart. Judge Cornelius Whitman arrived with a reputation for fairness that was unusual among territorial officials, but also with political pressures that made impartiality difficult when cases involved federal policy regarding Indian affairs and military authority over civilian marriages. His careful examination of the legal documents Marcel had hastily assembled, marriage certificates from a sympathetic preacher in a neighboring county, baptismal records showing Ayana's conversion to Christianity, sworn statements about her renunciation of tribal loyalties, revealed someone who understood that law existed to serve justice rather than simply enforce political expedience. The hearing that followed was conducted in Marcel's own parlor, transformed into an impromptu courtroom, where the most important legal questions involved not just territorial statute, but fundamental issues about the rights of individuals to choose their own destinies, regardless of racial classifications that government policies treated as absolute and unchangeable. Captain Morrison presented his case with military precision, arguing that Apache women who had left reservations without permission were fugitives regardless of subsequent marriages or religious conversions that might be used to evade federal jurisdiction. Ayana's testimony in her own defense revealed the intelligence and dignity that had impressed Marcel from their first conversation, as she spoke about her choice to leave tribal life for Christianity and marriage, with the kind of articulate conviction that made her conversion seem genuine rather than convenient. Her description of the massacre that had driven her into the desert, combined with her explanation of how Marcel's kindness had led to religious awakening and romantic love, created a narrative that was both legally persuasive and emotionally compelling. Marcel's defense of their marriage went beyond legal technicalities into passionate advocacy for the right of two adults to choose their own path toward happiness, despite social conventions that would keep them apart. His willingness to risk his own standing in the community and his property rights for the sake of protecting his wife demonstrated commitment that impressed even Captain Morrison, though it didn't necessarily change his determination to enforce federal policy regarding Indian affairs regardless of personal circumstances. Judge Whitman's questions during the proceedings revealed someone wrestling with competing interpretations of law and justice as territorial marriage statutes conflicted with federal Indian policies in ways that had never been tested in actual courtrooms. When he announced that he would need time to research legal precedents and consult with federal authorities before rendering a decision, both Marcel and Ayanna understood that their fate was being determined by forces larger than their individual situation. They had become test cases in conflicts between different levels of government authority and different definitions of what justice meant for people whose love crossed boundaries that politics preferred to keep absolute. The 3 days between Judge Whitman's hearing and his scheduled ruling stretched like years for Marcel and Ayanna, who continued their daily ranch routine, while knowing that every shared meal, every evening conversation, every moment of physical intimacy might be among their last as a legally married couple. The uncertainty created a strange intensity in their relationship, as if impending separation had stripped away any pretense of taking their love for granted, leaving them acutely aware of how precious their time together had become. Their neighbors' reactions to news of the hearing revealed the complex attitudes about interracial relationships that existed in frontier communities where survival often mattered more than social conventions, but where federal pressure could make acceptance dangerous for anyone who chose tolerance over conformity. Some offered quiet support for a couple whose partnership had proven beneficial to the entire community, while others suggested that Marcel's devotion to his Apache wife was admirable but potentially destructive for everyone who might be painted with the same brush of Indian sympathy. The arrival of unexpected allies during their wait provided hope that hadn't existed during the initial crisis, as Father Miguel Santos, the Catholic priest who had performed their marriage ceremony, arrived with legal documentation that supported the validity of their union under church law regardless of government policies that might challenge civil recognition. His testimony about Ayanna's sincere conversion and her commitment to Christian principles added religious authority to their legal position while demonstrating that not all representatives of white civilization viewed Indian assimilation as impossible or undesirable. But it was the appearance of Thomas Clearwater, a successful rancher whose own mixed heritage had made him sensitive to the challenges faced by people who didn't fit neatly into racial categories, that provided the most significant support for their cause. His offer to testify about Ayanna's character and Marcel's standing in the community carried weight that came from someone who had navigated similar challenges and achieved the kind of success that made his opinions difficult to dismiss as romantic idealism or misguided sympathy. The evening before Judge Whitman's scheduled ruling found Marcel and Ayanna sitting together on their porch, holding hands while watching stars emerge over landscape that had witnessed their journey from strangers to lovers to legal combatants fighting for the right to remain together. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Marcel said, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm his careful composure, "I want you to know that loving you has been the most important thing I've ever done. You've made me a better man than I ever thought possible." Ayanna's response, whispered against his ear as she held him close, carried all the love and fear and desperate hope of someone who had found paradise and might be forced to watch it disappear because other people couldn't accept that love was stronger than the artificial boundaries they used to divide the world into acceptable and unacceptable categories of human connection. Judge Whitman's decision, delivered in the same parlor where the hearing had been conducted, would establish legal precedent that would influence similar cases throughout the territory for years to come. His careful recitation of relevant statutes and constitutional principles revealed someone who had spent sleepless nights wrestling with questions that went far beyond simple law interpretation into fundamental issues about individual rights versus government authority, and the nature of citizenship in a nation still defining what equality might mean in practice. The law is clear that territorial marriage statutes take precedence over federal Indian policies when dealing with individuals who have legally renounced tribal citizenship and embraced American civil society, he began, his formal language unable to disguise the relief in his voice, as he found legal grounds for a decision that his personal conscience had already embraced. Mrs. Beaumont's conversion to Christianity, combined with her marriage to a citizen in good standing, establishes her legal status as an American citizen with all attendant rights and protections. Captain Morrison's objection was swift and predictable, arguing that Apache women couldn't simply abandon their tribal identity through convenient religious conversions that served to evade federal oversight rather than representing genuine cultural transformation. But Judge Whitman's response revealed extensive research into legal precedents that supported individual choice over government racial classifications when those choices were supported by documented evidence of sincere commitment to American cultural and religious values. The ruling that followed was both victory and warning, as Judge Whitman granted full legal recognition to their marriage while cautioning that federal Indian policies were evolving rapidly and that future challenges to their status were possible if political attitudes shifted toward more restrictive interpretations of citizenship and racial identity. "The law protects you today," he said directly to Ayanna, "but law is shaped by people whose opinions can change with circumstances. Your best protection will be continued demonstration that your choice to join American society was genuine and beneficial to the community that has accepted you." As Captain Morrison departed with obvious frustration but legal obligation to accept the court's decision, Marcel and Ayanna found themselves officially free to continue their life together while understanding that their love story had become part of larger historical forces that would determine the fate of countless other couples whose relationships challenged conventional boundaries. Their personal victory felt both complete and fragile, a triumph of individual determination over institutional prejudice that would require constant vigilance to maintain against future challenges that seemed inevitable in a territory where federal policies toward Indians were becoming increasingly harsh and uncompromising. The months following Judge Whitman's ruling brought a transformation in their social status that neither Marcel nor Ayanna had dared hope for during the dark days when their marriage's legality hung in the balance. Their victory in territorial court had established them as symbols of successful Indian assimilation for people who supported such possibilities, while their obvious happiness and productive partnership had won over neighbors who judged relationships by results rather than racial classifications. Ayanna's integration into the local community accelerated as her skills with horses and her knowledge of practical medicine made her valuable to neighbors who learned to appreciate her contributions rather than focus on her unusual background. The Women's Church Auxiliary elected her as a member, despite initial reservations about her Apache heritage, while her work with sick children during a winter fever epidemic earned gratitude that transcended racial prejudice and established her as someone essential to community welfare. Marcel's ranch prospered as their partnership allowed them to expand operations that would have been impossible for one person to manage alone, while Ayanna's understanding of water sources and grazing patterns helped them develop the most successful cattle operation in their section of the territory. Their financial success provided security that made their relationship less vulnerable to economic pressures that might have forced them apart if survival had required choices between love and practical necessity. The arrival of other mixed couples in the territory, drawn by news of their legal victory and the community acceptance they had achieved, created a network of mutual support that strengthened everyone's position while demonstrating that their success wasn't unique, but rather part of larger possibilities for cultural integration when people chose understanding over prejudice. Thomas Clearwater's introduction of two other mixed families to the region created a community within the community that provided social connections and mutual protection. But it was the news of Ayana's pregnancy that truly solidified their place in local society, as the prospect of children born to their union forced even skeptical neighbors to confront the reality that their relationship was permanent and productive rather than temporary and scandalous. The baby growing within her represented the future in ways that made abstract arguments about racial mixing give way to practical concerns about ensuring that the next generation would inherit a world where love could triumph over the artificial boundaries that had made their own happiness so difficult to achieve and maintain. The birth of their daughter in the spring of 1887 was attended by women from throughout the valley, their collective presence around Ayana's childbed speaking to acceptance that had been earned through years of proving that character mattered more than ancestry when determining someone's place in a frontier community that valued contribution over conformity. The baby girl who entered the world with her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes seemed to embody the possibility of harmony between cultures that had been defined as irreconcilably different. Little Marie Esperanza, named for Marcel's grandmother and Ayana's hope for a better future, displayed from her earliest days the kind of robust health that suggested she had inherited the best genetic gifts from both her parents' lineages. Her unusual size for an infant promised that she would grow into the kind of strength that had made both her parents exceptional, while her obvious intelligence and alert curiosity suggested mental capabilities that would allow her to navigate the complex world she'd been born into. The community's response to the baby's arrival revealed how completely Marcel and Ayana's integration had been achieved. As neighbors competed to provide gifts and assistance that demonstrated genuine affection for the family that had become central to the valley's social fabric. The christening ceremony performed by Father Santos drew attendance from families who had traveled significant distances to witness what many viewed as a celebration of successful cultural fusion rather than simple religious ritual. Ayana's natural skill as a mother surprised no one who had observed her patient intelligence in other challenging situations, while Marcel's transformation into a devoted father revealed emotional depths that his years of solitary living had hidden even from himself. Their partnership in child-rearing mirrored the successful cooperation they had achieved in every other aspect of their life together, creating a family dynamic that served as a model for other couples who were learning that love could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable to people with less courage and determination. The letters they received from government officials and religious leaders in other territories, seeking advice about successful Indian assimilation policies, indicated that their personal story had achieved significance beyond their immediate community. Requests for Ayana to speak at conferences about cultural integration and for Marcel to advise on policies supporting interracial marriages suggested that their love story had become part of larger historical movements toward understanding and acceptance that would benefit countless other couples whose relationships challenged conventional boundaries that were slowly but steadily expanding to accommodate the reality of American diversity. The arrival of a new territorial governor with strict policies regarding Indian affairs brought renewed pressure on their legally established marriage, as federal authorities sought to overturn previous court decisions that had granted citizenship to Indians who had left reservations without official permission. The legal challenges that followed tested every aspect of their documented conversion and assimilation, while political pressure mounted from Washington to enforce policies that would prevent other Indians from using marriage as a means of escaping reservation control. The hearing that determined their fate this time was conducted in the territorial capital, where Judge Whitman's local precedent faced scrutiny from federal judges whose political appointments made them more responsive to Washington policies than to individual circumstances. The legal team that Marcel assembled for their defense included territorial legislators who viewed their case as important for establishing principles of individual rights versus federal authority over racial classifications that affected many citizens beyond just Indian affairs. Ayana's testimony during the federal hearing demonstrated how completely she had mastered American legal language and cultural concepts, her articulate defense of her choices revealing someone who had not simply adopted surface behaviors but had genuinely embraced principles of individual liberty and Christian morality that formed the foundation of American civil society. Her ability to quote legal precedents and constitutional principles impressed federal judges who had expected to encounter someone whose assimilation was superficial rather than profound. The federal ruling that upheld their citizenship and marriage rights established legal precedent that protected not just their individual relationship, but similar cases throughout the Western territories, creating a framework that balanced federal Indian policies with individual rights to choose cultural identity and religious affiliation. The decision acknowledged that successful assimilation required recognizing genuine conversion rather than forcing people to remain trapped by racial classifications that ignored personal choice and cultural adaptation. Their victory in federal court was celebrated throughout the territory by supporters who viewed their case as proof that American ideals of individual liberty could overcome racial prejudice when courage and determination were combined with legal intelligence and community support. The telegram they received from President Grover Cleveland's office, congratulating them on successful integration that exemplified American values, indicated that their personal story had achieved national significance as an example of what was possible when people chose understanding over hatred and cooperation over conflict. 10 years after Marcel first found Ayana dying beside the dry creek bed, their ranch had become a gathering place for mixed families throughout the Southwest, a sanctuary where couples who faced similar challenges could find community support and practical advice about navigating legal and social obstacles that still confronted relationships that crossed racial boundaries. Their success had inspired dozens of other couples to seek happiness despite conventional opposition, creating a network of mutual assistance that strengthened everyone's position. Their children, Marie Esperanza, now joined by twin boys whose combination of Apache and French features made them uniquely beautiful and obviously intelligent, were growing up trilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable with Apache spiritual traditions and Christian religious practice, with French intellectual heritage and American frontier pragmatism. Their academic achievements and social popularity in the territorial school system demonstrated that mixed heritage could be a source of strength rather than confusion when children were raised by parents who valued all aspects of their cultural inheritance. Ayana's work as a cultural mediator between Apache communities and territorial authorities had helped prevent several conflicts that might have escalated into the kind of violence that had destroyed her original band, while her success in helping other Apache women adapt to life off reservations had earned recognition from government officials who were beginning to understand that voluntary assimilation was more effective than forced containment for achieving peaceful coexistence between cultures. Marcel's expansion of their ranch into a model agricultural operation that employed workers from multiple ethnic backgrounds had demonstrated the economic benefits of cultural cooperation, while providing practical proof that diversity could be profitable as well as morally correct. His innovations in cattle breeding and water management had influenced ranching practices throughout the territory, while his political advocacy for immigrant rights had helped shape territorial policies that protected vulnerable populations from exploitation and discrimination. As they sat together on their porch watching their children play in the yard where their love story had begun with desperate rescue and careful healing, Marcel and Ayana reflected on a journey that had transformed them from lonely individuals into the foundation of a community that proved love could overcome any obstacle that prejudice might create. Their story had become legend throughout the territory, inspiring countless other couples to believe that happiness was possible for anyone brave enough to choose love over social convention, understanding over hatred, and hope over the kind of fear that kept people trapped in lives smaller than their dreams deserved. The lonely cowboy who had taken in a giant Apache woman had discovered that salvation sometimes arrived in unexpected packages, while the woman who had fled genocide had learned that home could be found in the heart of someone who saw her strength as gift rather than threat. Together, they had created proof that love was indeed the most powerful force in a world that too often forgot that connection was stronger than the artificial boundaries people used to keep themselves apart from the very relationships that could save them from the isolation that made life barely worth living.